produtor rural no Brasil. Você visitou, me parece, no Rio de Janeiro, uma fazenda de orgânicos, não foi?
No. I have not visited any farms in Brazil yet. I really wish I had had a chance. I've read a lot about agroecology in Brazil. You know, one of the things people don't realize is that a highly diversified farm of the kind I was describing earlier, where there are 10, 20, 30 different crops, animals and plants together, produces more food per hectare than a giant farm of soya or maize, of corn. We get this, we hear that only industrial agriculture can feed the world because it's so productive, but it's not really producing food. It's producing animal feed. 30% of what we're growing is going to feed animals, which is a very inefficient way to feed the world. It produces ethanol, which we're putting in our cars, which is not feeding anybody except our cars. And that these diversified farms are highly productive. So why aren't there more of them? Well, they take a lot of labor, and I think that's the key. The challenge to feeding the world is going to be how many farmers do we have, not how much land we have. How many farmers do we have? Because the more complicated the farming, the more diversified the farming, the more eyes you need on the land. And that's what worries me. If we empty out our rural areas and everybody moves to the city, and we have one big farm out there trying to grow our food, it's not going to work. It's just not going to work. So it's very important, I think, in the developing world for governments to support agroecology and have programs that keep people on the land, where they can produce for themselves and for the cities, and produce real food and not these commodities. Because we shouldn't, when we look at that field of soya, that is not food. That is food for pigs in China. That's what the best land in Brazil is being used for now. The Chinese like to eat pork, and they don't want to waste their land on soya, so they're very happy that you oblige with yours. And so I think that these issues of food security, but also food sovereignty, who makes the decisions about how a country's land gets used, who controls the land, are going to be the geopolitical issues in the future. Because as the population grows, there'll be more competition for resources. And so I lost track of the question, but I hope that answered it.
Bom, mas isso é realmente uma questão que o Brasil está vivendo agora, porque a gente está num momento de expansão agrícola e há uma ideologia vigente de que o Brasil é o celeiro do mundo, e que haverá, nós seremos os fornecedores de comida para um mundo sem comida. Existe também uma ideia de que os orgânicos e todas essas iniciativas mais sustentáveis seriam insustentáveis num plano demográfico de 7 bilhões de pessoas, né? Então, que seria, há quem diga, inclusive, que os orgânicos são uma forma de distinção social, né? Você, eu como orgânico, então sou melhor do que você. Você considera, como você enfrenta esse tipo de crítica, e como você vê a experiência do Brasil, você vem dos Estados Unidos, que é um grande país agrícola, que já passou por algumas desses processos de agricultura extensiva que a gente está vendo no Brasil, com transgênicos, com organismos modificados. Como é que foi a experiência americana nesse sentido?
Well, the feed the world argument is a very important question, and it has to be addressed with first a frank acknowledgement that we don't know how to feed 9 or 10 billion people. We have some ideas, but the assertion that industrial agriculture is necessary to feed the world is unproven. And I think can be disproved. I mean, consider that now, where we have industrial agriculture over a large portion of the United States, over a large portion of South America, highly productive commodity agriculture, with GM usually, is failing to feed the world that we have now, the world of 6 billion people or 7 billion people. even though we are growing nearly 3,000 calories per person per day. You only need 2,000 calories. So we're growing all this food, but we have 1 billion people hungry in the world today, and we have 1 billion people overfed. We are stuffed and starved at the same time. So it tells you that quantity is not the only issue here. It has to do with, do you have money to buy that food? It's an issue of equity. The people in Qatar or Bahrain have eat more food than anybody on the planet right now. The Emirates, and they grow nothing, but they have the money to command the food. So this issue that if you merely grow plenty of food and you treat agriculture as a sacrifice zone to generate all these calories, everybody will be well fed. There is no evidence that that will be the case, and it's not the case now. So you have to look at what are you using that food for. 30% to feed animals. Very inefficient way to feed the world, because it takes 10 pounds of grain to grow 1 pound of beef. So much better to have people eat grain. You could feed a lot more people. Another 20% of what we're growing is going to ethanol. That could be food. And then we have 40% of all the food we're growing in the world today is wasted, simply wasted, on the farm, through processing, and in the back of your refrigerator. So there is a lot of slack in this system that if you allocated the land and the crops differently, you could feed a lot more people. Now, whether sustainable agriculture could be that productive is a real question. Right now, organic yields are lower than conventional yields. Not by a lot, by about 10 to 20%. However, those farms are much more resilient to the kinds of challenges we're going to face. See, the genius of industrial agriculture is that it, with the perfect hybrid seed, it can produce large amounts, but everything has to go right. You have to control for water. You have to control for fertilizer. You have to control for pests, because these super plants they're like princes. You know, they're very delicate and they need to be pampered. But as soon as you have climate change, all bets are off, because you can't count on the weather. You can't count on the amount of water. You need an agriculture that is more resilient, even if it is somewhat less productive. And what you find with organic agriculture, which takes care of the soil and focuses on the soil, if you have a healthy organic soil, the plants actually produce more in drought years than industrial agriculture. More. And they do fine in very wet years. So what you have with a good soil is a resilience that you don't have with industrial agriculture, which is very brittle. So I feel as we head into this era of gross uncertainty in agriculture, organic is going to look better and better and better.
Bom, você falou dos micro-organismos, né, alguns deles ligados à terra, né? Alguns outros desses micro-organismos são ligados ao ar, né, os fermentos, né, que fazem o pão, a cerveja. Eu queria que você falasse como esses 4 elementos aparecem no livro Cozinhar, que acabou de sair, contando a histórias saborosas, personagens que você encontrou ao fazer a pesquisa.
Yeah, okay. Well, as I said, I had a great time writing this book, and it's organized by the 4 classical elements. And I begin with fire, which is the oldest kind of cooking. It's 2 million years old. We've been cooking with fire. It is the discovery that set us apart. It changed us as a species. When we mastered fire, that's the moment when our brains got much bigger than the other apes and our guts shrank. Now we're going in the other direction. But and the reason was that cooked food is more nutritious than raw food. And that when you cook food, it's partially digested outside of the body. It's broken down. So your body doesn't have to use as much energy to break it down. And you don't have to spend as much time chewing. I learned in my research that apes our size spend half their waking hours in the act of chewing. It's very hard to get much done if you're spending 6 or 8 hours a day chewing. But cooking relieved us and opened up all this time for wonderful things like literary festivals and such. For that section, I spent time with barbecue pitmasters, kind of people who do this whole hog barbecue. They take a whole pig, they cook it very slowly over a coals, not even a fire, 24 hours, 20 hours to cook. And I went down to North Carolina for that. And I met Ed Mitchell, who's this wonderful character. He's a big black Santa Claus with a white beard, and he was very generous in sharing his secrets. And the secret of great barbecue turns out to be time. Slow and slow. Cook your meat. And I've applied that. I mean, most of us cook food too fast because we're in a rush. But when you slow down, you get wonderful results. And then water, I learned really everyday home cooking. That's braising. Cooking in pots doesn't happen until only 10,000 years ago, because we didn't have pots you could put over a fire. And that's a huge development for our species, because you know, when you cook meat over a flame, you lose a lot of nutrients. They drip into the fire. But if you cook in a pot, you save everything, and you get this wonderful dividend called sauce. And it allows you to soften grain and make porridges, which allows you to have agriculture. So without the cook pot, you would not have agriculture, because agriculture is essentially growing lots of hard seeds that need to be ground and wetted. And it also allowed you to extend the human lifespan, because now you had soft foods, soups and porridges, that you could feed to babies so you could wean them earlier, and you could feed to old people and keep them alive. Because before that, when you lost your teeth, you were kind of screwed. And but now you could keep people alive longer. In baking, I'll jump ahead and talk about one character who I particularly liked. Baking, I talk about bread, and I learned how to bake bread, and that's an amazing process, because it involves not only heat and water, but microbes to ferment the bread. And I learned from a food scientist, actually, that if I gave you a big bag of flour, even whole grain flour, and water, you could live for a few weeks, but that's about it on that. But if you took that flour and water and turned it into bread, you could live indefinitely. And it is the action of those microbes and the heat that makes that substandard food, flour, into something that can support human life. And the reason is that the microbes, basically flour is a seed, it's a crushed grass seed, and it's designed to feed the next generation of the tight in these long chain molecules, and the carbohydrates become available to us. So fermented grain is much healthier, which, you know, if you're making porridge, you should try to ferment it if you can, a little bit. And then when you bake it, you can get the grain hotter than you could in a porridge, because you can't boil anything more than the boiling point. But the loaf of bread becomes a pressure cooker, and all those little bubbles of air steam. And steam can get much hotter than the boiling point. And that cooks the starch at such a high temperature, 400 or 500 degrees, I don't know what it is in Celsius, and that makes the carbohydrates very digestible. So anyway, but the character I want to tell you about is a nun named Sister Noella, who makes cheese in Connecticut. She makes a French cheese called the Saint-Nectaire. And I went to learn how to make cheese with her. And she's, in addition to being a nun, she's a microbiologist.